It was the first thing we tried that we saw the Aboriginal people eating it, and they seemed to eat a lot of it, so we wanted to try it as well. And I've eaten kangaroo. I don't know, I'm sure many of you have here. It's hard to prepare. You don't overcook it. And they do sell it in supermarkets throughout Australia. But you've got to hurry. It jumps off the shelf. Oh, I'm sorry. It's the last talk I'm giving, probably ever. The kangaroo was something that mystified the English. They originally thought that they were man-eating. They were, you know, some of them are this big. The old man kangaroos, sometimes bigger than a man. And they used to see them like going like this, boxing, and they actually took them back to France and to England, and they boxed them with a man. Particularly dangerous because the kangaroo tail is a massive muscle, and one whack of that and it could do an extraordinary amount of harm. Now, I'm going to sing you a song called The Old Man Kangaroo. A lot of these old songs that I picked up over the last umpteen dozen years, and taping them from old-timers, mostly born in the 19th century, were sung unaccompanied. They weren't sung with an instrument. They were just sung as story songs. So you can imagine that this one, which I dated back to 1836, right? I got a print version of it, but I also recorded somebody singing a bit of it. Talks about two men going into the bush, and one of them gets into a boxing match with a kangaroo. Okay, well, I'll let your imagination and the song tell you what happened to the kangaroo. Oh, me and me brother Billy got lost in the mallee scrub. For 3 long days and 3 long nights we never tasted grub. And on the 3rd, my blessed word, when everything seemed blue, old Billy spied, with his joyful pride, an old man kangaroo. Well, up and at him Billy went with a waddy in his hand. But oh, what overcome my mate, he made old Billy go. He made a blow at that hairy foe, a blow I will tell you. But as sure as fate, he got hold of me mate, did this old man kangaroo. He grabbed him firmly round the waist, and Billy began to roar. Oh, such a terrible struggle as this I've never seen before. Oh, spare me days, old Billy says, he'll break me back in two. Oh, do be quick and grab a stick and kill this kangaroo. Well, creeping round behind him, my swag I opened wide, and pulling it down over his head, I then securely tied around his neck. It seemed to check his progress. Then I drew out my blade, and with a swish I tailed that kangaroo. Now a kangaroo without a tail can't hop, you all must know. And feeling his appendage gone, he let poor Billy go. He gave a moan, a terrible moan, a moan I will tell you. But as sure as fate, he let go of me mate, did this old man kangaroo. Now Billy had been bruised about, but scarcely hurt was he. And turning round to me, said, we'll have a jolly good feed. So Billy put on the billy can, and he made a splendid stew. And the sweetest meat I ever did eat was that old man kangaroo. The gold rush sent prices of food soaring. And some people said that they thought Australia was very expensive. It was much more expensive back then. The cost of anything in Australia was ridiculous. And people had lots of money, most people, or some people, and they paid outrageous prices for things. But it was up in the goldfields that this extraordinary sort of food stories evolved. I'm going to show you some remarkable photographs. It's from the Holterman collection at the Mitchell Library in Sydney. Holterman went up to Hill End in the 1860s, early 1860s, and he took some photographs, and they're particularly good photographs, but I'm just showing you a few of hundreds in his collection. This is a very primitive coffee shop, and you notice that they sold hot pies, the Australian national dish. They did drink tea, but they also drank coffee in Australia. It was thick stuff, and they put chicory essence into it to give it a bit of a boost. Okay, here's one of Haldeman's collection photographs, the Café de France, with an Italian owner by the looks of it. Would have been flash. Can you believe it? This is up the bush. We're talking about a good 2 or 3 days ride. They're selling oysters. Oysters. How did they do that? I'll tell you how they did it. They had ice ships. Ships, and all they'd brought down was ice from Boston down to Australia. The ships were insulated. The ice would have lost only about 10%. When these ships came into Sydney or Melbourne, they would put some of the ice on stagecoaches and take them out to Hill End or Ballarat in Victoria and Bendigo. They'd lose maybe another 20%. So by the time they got there, there was still blocks of ice, which they auctioned off, and the local hotels and tents and places like this would buy them and charge the miners very high prices to have shaved ice in their drinks, and hopefully fresh oysters came out with the ice, because otherwise I have no idea how they kept these oysters, unless they were pre-cooked and brought out here. But there you go, ice ships. The diggers got so fussy, they insisted only on having ice from certain lakes in Boston, the right-hand side of the lake. Don't believe me, do you? Okay, colonial wine and dining rooms would have been small, but just remember this was for sustenance, not to go there and have a jolly good time. They would eat and run. Okay, the campfire was vital to the Australian story and the New Zealand story. It was a neutral territory where everybody from the highest to the lowest would sit round and have a cup of tea and make some sort of bread. We call it damper, but it has many other names, brownies. It depends on what you put in to the damper. If it's just plain damper, it's damper. But, and they called flour dust. They called it dust. But they improvised, you know. Out there on some of the shearing sheds, I've heard stories where they've made currant buns. And they didn't have any currants. But I can tell you now that blowflies were a good substitute. It gave you the crunch, they looked like currants, and nobody knew the difference. Well, that's true. Okay, that's a damper, and that's what they cooked them in. These sort of Dutch oven type urns. And I've tasted some good stuff. It was there to actually keep the stomach lined and full for these people who worked from dawn till dusk and sometimes later, and insisted on having an endless supply of billy tea and damper. In fact, they lived on damper, tea and mutton, mutton being aged lamb. In fact, there was a poem that talks about this wonderful cuisine. You can talk of your... Hang on, how's that go? Do I remember that? You can talk of your restaurants of Paris renowned, or for plenty through London may roam. But if variety's pleasing, leave either town and go to the bush for a change. On Monday we've mutton with damper and tea. On Tuesday, tea, damper and mutton. On Wednesday, mutton, tea, damper, while we with our flocks over hill and dale scamper. On Thursday, we have mutton with damper and tea. On Friday, tea, damper and mutton. On Saturday, tea, damper, mutton. And surely I've shown you on the Australian table is plenty of good tucker put on. But no, rest assured, another fine treat awaits all men on one day. For all bushmen know they're sure to meet with all three of those buggers on Sunday. And they used to put Cocky's Joy, they called it. It was thick, black, sugary treacle, an extract of the sugar cane. And they used to smother this damper with this sticky black stuff, and they loved it. Cocky's Joy. And that's the old billy boiling. Billy was very important. The average bushman in the 1870s consumed 60 litres of hot China tea every week. Some of them used to drink it so much they'd get a yellow stain around their beards. And they used to call that, you've been kissing Jack the Painter, they used to call it. It was black China tea. And they'd have sugar in it. There was no milk usually, so they just had it straight. There's a wonderful story in the Australian story of a family called the Rudd family. And they'd been facing hard times. They hadn't any supplies, and in fact they'd run out of the most vital of ingredients, and that was tea. And Dad Rudd refused to let this get the family down, so he got some of that damper and he boiled up a kettle of billy, and he scraped this burnt damper. He burnt it with a forky stick in the fire, and he scraped it in there, put some sugar in it, made all the family drink this, and they all agreed it was probably one of the best cups of tea they've ever had. And that was the sort of determination that sort of made Australia and the early pioneers survive. Just that hope and the fact that they knew they could survive. Okay, the galah, an Australian bird. There's an old joke about how to cook them. You take two plump galahs and you pluck their feathers, and you put an axe head or a couple of big rocks in the billy, boil it up, and when the axe head or the rocks are soft, the galahs are ready to eat. It's actually true, because if you pluck the feathers out, the skin contracts. However, if you get the birds and soak them and sort of carefully take the feathers out, so you're not doing that, you can roast them and they're plump and they're tasty, but that took a little bit to learn. The old bullockies, they had a spit and a good look round for breakfast. That was usually it. Then they'd have a cup of tea. The shearers in both New Zealand and Australia, as I said, were the backbones of the country. And they used to love tormenting the cooks. They elected the cooks. They weren't cooks usually that came along and said, I'm a cook. They were usually people who drew the short straw at the beginning of the shearing season. They all actually physically drew straws to see who'd be the droving or the shearer's cook. You didn't have to know how to cook. You had to know how to fight. Seriously, if anybody complained, it'd be like, out the back, you know. I know of a story of a shearer who was just sick and tired of this horrible stew that the station cook kept delivering every night, and he reckoned that the cook had never cleaned the stew pot out ever. He just kept topping it up. And he said one night, as the cook put the thing down on the table, he said, "That's stew." And the shearer said, "Is it?" And the cook said, "Well, any man that doesn't think it's stew can come outside and see me." And this shearer said, "Oh." So he came outside and there was this whack, whack, whack. And the shearer came into the shed, looked at all the other blokes. He said, "That's stew, all right." They used to give them nicknames. Greasy Soul. They reckoned he'd never washed his hands since he got to the station. Or the Bait Layer. Or the Curry Poisoner. They just gave them all sorts of names.